it feels like it's these characters really talking to you, even though their dialogue and their song lyrics are written by two completely different people. Hey there, thanks for being here. This is Off Book, and I'm your host, Marc Stoufer III. In each episode this season, we'll be taking a look at a different musical and breaking down the music and story of the show to try to understand what makes it so popular. Today's episode is all about Dear Evan Hansen. Dear Evan Hansen started its first production in Washington, D.C. in 2015 and moved off Broadway to the Second Stage Theatre in March of 2016. Later that year, it transferred to Broadway at the Music Box Theatre. As is the pattern with the shows this season, it's closed due to COVID, but will reopen with the rest of Broadway when it's safe to do so. Additionally, it got a national tour, a Canadian production, and a West End production, and Universal Studios has also announced that they are in the middle of making a movie adaptation. The show's not free from criticism. I definitely don't think it's a perfect show, but it's received a lot of praise overall. What's made it the sensation it's become? Let's dive in. I think part of what makes Dear Evan Hansen so successful is that it's a story that a lot of different people can relate to in a lot of different ways. Much like last week's show, Be More Chill, Dear Evan Hansen is set in a high school, but unlike Be More Chill, it tells the stories of a lot of different kinds of people. You don't have just the one lead and then a whole bunch of supporting characters. Evan is the lead and definitely does get the most stage time and the most prominent arcs, but the show also tells the story of his friend Jared, who's kind of going through his own arc, and Connor Murphy. You don't learn a bunch about him, but you do start to get the kind of feeling about who he was, and you start to understand more about his character, and Connor's parents, and Evan's mom. All of these characters have their own plots, and they're all such different characters. The parents in Be More Chill don't really exist aside from kind of set up to a couple jokes, and then they have their own arc, but a lot of it happens off stage. Whereas in this show, they're not as big as the high schoolers, but the parents do have a lot of character development, and so I think that allows people that are in high school, that are younger than high school, that are older than high school, that have their own high schoolers, the parents that go to see this show, can all kind of relate to it in a different way, because in some way, shape, or form, they've been through something similar. And it's probably not to the same degree that the characters in this musical are living. I don't want to spoil the plot, so if you want to go look it up, you can. Most musicals are dramatized and are kind of heightened reality situations, so it's very rare that you find a situation in a musical where you can say, I've been in that specifically. There probably are people. This is one of the more realistic musicals, I think, in terms of the plot and the likelihood that an audience member has been through it. But I still think that most people haven't been in a situation that's comparable. But the way that these characters respond is something that feels very human, and it feels a lot like something that we've experienced. Even though we've never necessarily experienced it, we feel connected to these characters because their reactions to things that they're going through seem an awful lot like the reactions to things that we've gone through. And so it kind of brings everybody in the audience together, and the cast and the audience together, so it allows everybody to feel connected, and I think that that's ultimately the point of the show. And it does it in a way that doesn't try to hit you over the head with it. It just tells a story that has a lot of different components and a lot of different kinds of people and kinds of stories, so that way everybody can kind of have their own personal connection with part of the show. It makes the audience members a part of the story, because as the story goes on, you can start to see the conflict continue to get more and more intense, and we know as the audience that we would like to stop this, but we have no idea how. We know that everyone wants to stop it, but that he doesn't know how, and we also want to try to help him and try to find a way to stop it, but we can't. It's a lot like what I said with Phantom a couple weeks ago, where we know that the problem is happening and that it needs to be stopped, and that if it doesn't get stopped, it's going to end very, very badly. But we don't know how to stop it. We're right there along with the characters trying to solve the problem and seeing it just spiral more and more out of control, but also knowing that we don't have a better solution. We know that what the characters are doing isn't going to help anything, but we don't know how to help. And so by making the audience kind of an active viewer instead of just a passive viewer watching something that they know will be resolved, watching something that they feel like won't be resolved, and that they don't know how could even be resolved in a nice, clean way, makes it so much more interesting to watch, because you can feel the emotions that the characters are feeling. You feel invested. You want the show to continue to tell you what's coming next. It's not just I'm impressed by this and I'm enjoying this and it's entertaining to watch. I also am feeling emotions, and that's part of what makes this show mean so much to so many people, is they get invested in these characters' stories, even though it's only a couple hours of stage time. It feels like it's so much longer in a good way, because you feel like you're right there with them, living your life and trying to help them as people, because you can see parts of yourself in them and you feel like you're right there alongside them during the show. It allows you to have such a deep and personal connection. Another thing about this show is that it's very well thought out and very well executed, and it's a very realistic plot. There are a lot of shows that are fun to watch but aren't super realistic or have a lot of plot holes, and so it's a show that you can't really think about the plot too much. This thing doesn't make sense, but I really can't find any of those in this plot. It's a very well written plot, and not only are the kind of the plot points well thought out, the way that they move between them seems realistic, which is hard to do in a way that doesn't make it seem like you're moving between plot points. You don't want the audience to feel like you're telling your plot point and then you're just kind of transitioning to the next one. It has to feel very organic, and like these characters' actions are causing this plot point, and then the actions that led to that plot point are continuing to lead them to more choices, which is then going to lead them to the next plot point. But it can't feel like you kind of set out these plot markers to begin with and then are kind of backtracking to find them. And the show does that very well. It makes it feel like every choice that they're making has 18 other choices that they could have made, and the one that they made fits their character and leads to the next course of action that makes sense. It's all very well written and well edited too. You know, people often say that writing is in rewriting, that the best writing is when you can take your first draft and turn it into something that makes more sense and kind of eliminate some of those plot holes and just make it better. And I think that the writers, or the editors, I guess, of Dear Evan Hansen did a very good job making sure that it all made sense, that it all flowed, and that it's very well, checked out. And also, the dialogue in these scenes is very well written. It's hard to get dialogue right, especially for real people, because theater's in such a heightened state. It's hard to balance the fact that we're in a heightened state where people are just kind of singing their emotions, but also it sounds like the way that people would actually talk. Not to mention the fact that this isn't just high schoolers. You have to have high schoolers, and you have to have adults. You have to have single parents, and you have to have families going through distress. And so trying to figure out how each character talks and then maintain that style through all of the scenes and carry that through into the way that they sing is hard to do in giving the show its own voice, but also giving each character their own voice and maintaining that realism in that, even though there's so much kind of heightened realism in the show. So it's hard to balance those two things, but I think the show does it very well and makes the show seem so much more realistic, and by grounding it so much more in reality, it creates a story that's so much more impactful at the end of the day, because it doesn't feel like it's happening in Broadway land where everything is cranked up to 11. It feels like it could be happening in real life, which is always going to be a story that feels more personal and feels more well thought out, because it is, and because it feels more like something that we've seen in real life, whether we have or not. It also leaves a lot of room for some really good performances. These characters are deeply flawed, and they have to make a lot of tough choices, and I don't think there's a single character in this show who doesn't make a mistake in the course of the two acts, and I love that, because people are like that too. People are going to do things that aren't right. They're going to make mistakes. They're going to mess up, and they're not going to suddenly start thinking of themselves or each other as terrible human beings all the time. So by creating these deeply multi-layered characters and then giving them the opportunity to mess up and letting them mess up and then kind of realize, I messed up, I'm going to try to fix it, and not entirely redeeming them by the end of the show, not saying,
well, everything was fixed and everyone forgave each other and they all lived happily ever after.
By letting those mistakes kind of hang in the air, and your idea of these characters is different than it was when you walked in, because they've done more, and so your opinion on them has changed. And I think that that's so smart, to make these characters a lot like real humans, because by creating a story that is something that a lot of people can relate to, setting it in the real world with real characters, with dialogue that sounds realistic, but putting it all in that heightened state, it just makes it feel so much more personal, but also so much more emotional, because that emotion that we feel on a day-to-day basis is now being expressed in song, and it makes it, you can pinpoint the emotion so much better. And I think that that's because the writers of this show have done such a good job in crafting a story that lets the actors then kind of take that writing and just make it so well performed and emotional and raw, and something that a lot of people can find themselves in. Today's episode is sponsored by Time Traveler, the new musical. I don't know if you're aware, but the music director of Dear Evan Hansen is Alex Lacamoire, who also music directed Hamilton. And the set designer of Dear Evan Hansen was David Correns, who also designed the set for Hamilton. They have something in common. It's Hamilton. They've collaborated on musical set in the past and the present, which is why I'm pitching my next project, a musical set in the future. Unfortunately, I don't know what the future is going to be like, so I have to invent time travel first. And once I put in all the work to invent time travel, I don't really think I'm going to have any effort left to come up with a plot, so now it's a musical about time travel. Time Traveler, the new musical, coming to Broadway whenever I can get in contact with Alex Lacamoire. Speaking of Alex Lacamoire, the music of this show is so good, and it's kind of to be expected. You have Alex Lacamoire, who is such an amazing music director. He creates the orchestrations and writes all the instrumentation of the show, and kind of picks what the pit will play, and kind of helps to elevate the lyrics so much more. And the lyricists of the show were also super good. Benj Pasek and Justin Paul do such a good job creating lyrics that feel like they're emotional and elevated, like I was saying, but that still sound like the characters, which is hard to do. It's hard to not suddenly change this word choice and the style as soon as you start singing, but they managed to create singing that feels like it's just talking. And that's not to say that it's not musical, it is, but the vocabulary, the inflection, the line length, it all feels like the way they actually talk in real life. And that helps the show to feel so much more coherent, because it feels like it's these characters really talking to you, even though their dialogue and their song lyrics are written by two completely different people. The book is written by Stephen Levinson, and then the lyrics are written by, like I said, Benj Pasek and Justin Paul. So even though it's two completely different, or I guess three different people writing the words that these characters are saying, they all worked together to create words that all sounded coherent across the different mediums, so it sounded like it was really them talking. I don't actually know what the writing process was like for the show. I don't know if the lyricist wrote the music and then handed it off to Alex Lacamoire to orchestrate, or if they were working together. It often varies depending on the process that the composers have. But what's striking to me is that it all works together very well in terms of, the lyrics and the melody and the orchestrations all sound like they were written at the same time, or at least that the collaborators were all on the exact same page about what they wanted. Take, for example, the opening to Waving to a Window.
I've learned to slam on the brake before I even turn the key.
Those opening notes were written by a completely different person than the people who wrote the lyrics. But the lyrics and the notes at the beginning seem to work together so incredibly well, and I think it creates that sense of harmony where the lyrics help to define what you're feeling at the beginning with that opening theme, but that opening theme gives you the exact right feeling to lead you into the lyrics. It sounds a little bit weird to be complimenting how music and lyrics go together because it's expected on Broadway, but it is very hard to do, and I think that this show does it so well. It doesn't just sound catchy. The music seems so emotional, and it's got a lot of people's attention because it can so well encapsulate a lot of different emotions, whether that's happiness or sadness or confusion or anxiety. Waving to a Window has been praised for kind of showing what anxiety feels like inside your mind, and the fact that it can do that so well when it's not even written by the same people is just something I can't stop thinking about, because even though it's not something that a lot of people often point out, it's very impressive that they were able to do that. The music of Dear Evan Hansen is kind of always what I think of when I'm trying to explain what a contemporary musical theater sound often is like. It is that very pop sound that's been kind of diluted and then infused with musical theater tendencies, so it ends up feeling a lot like the music that you hear even outside of Broadway. It sounds very much like pop music, but it also feels so much more emotional and personal. I talked about this back in season 2, where the sound of Broadway is entirely influenced by what music is popular. The golden age of musical theater, the music sounded like that because that's what people were listening to. And people are now listening to music that's much more like Dear Evan Hansen, so the music sounds much more like Dear Evan Hansen in Dear Evan Hansen. Does that make sense? I don't know. Anyway, it has such a unique sound because it manages to use the few instruments that it has to create such an iconic feel to it that can make those lyrics just shine. The instrumentation in this show, I think, doesn't sound super actively amazing, but it does so much behind the scenes to elevate the lyrics. I think that the lyrics get a huge spotlight put on them, and rightly so. Like I said, it's such a good extension of a character and how a character talks and how a character feels, and the way that they use reprises in the show, and some songs sound complicated and some songs sound simple in terms of rhyme scheme, in terms of verse structure, in terms of all the fancy music theory stuff. It's very well written, but also I think that the backing does a lot to elevate that. On the note of reprises, there's one specific song in the end of the first act called You Will Be Found.
Share it with the people you love. Repost.
The world needs to hear this.
A beautiful tribute.
Favorite. I know someone who really needed to hear this today. So thank you, Evan Hansen, for doing what you're doing.
I never met you, Connor, but coming on here, reading everyone's posts, it's so easy to feel alone, but Evan is exactly right. We're not alone.
We're not alone. None of us.
And that song was one of the most popular out of the show, probably a tie between that and Waving to a Window, because it's just such a good message, and it's so beautiful, and I think that it's a really good song, and I encourage you to go listen to the full thing. But then they also repeat it later in Act 2, and I can't play it for you right now because it isn't on the cast album, and there's a lot of language in it. But it takes this beautiful melody, and I think it changes the key. I don't have any sheet music for it, I don't know for sure, but I think it transposes it to the relative minor. And it uses the same idea of the choir singing You Will Be Found, and all the people from the internet talking over it with their own personal thoughts, but this time, instead of Evan bringing people together and talking about how important it is to feel connected, it's everybody kind of hating on the Murphys and being very rude and violent to them, and this is kind of the number when everything begins to crumble. And it's one of my favorite reprises ever, and I really wish that there were a good recording of it so I could play it for you. But it is a masterclass in how to take a theme and reuse it in such an intentional way. I don't love when people will reuse themes just to reuse themes. It needs to mean something, and this means something. It means everything. The Act 1 finale, You Will Be Found, is the beginning of Evan's ascent into popularity, into prominence. People start listening to him, they start caring about him. This is when everything starts looking up for him. And then they use that theme again when everything starts falling apart, and they use it in a way that makes your skin crawl. It feels, you can feel your heart sink as everything is just falling apart, and it's such a good use. Please go try to find a recording of it. I can't find one, but if you can even find a footage of a performance or something, it's such a good song. And I think that the show is full of good songs. I don't think they're as big and flashy, but really, I mean, Requiem is such a beautiful song.
Why should I play this game of pretend? Remembering through a secondhand sorrow. Why should I have a heavy heart? Why should I say I'll keep you with me? Why should I go and fall apart for you?
Breaking a Glove does such a good job highlighting the relationship that Evan starts to get with Larry.
It just takes a little patience. It takes a little time, a little perseverance, and a little uphill climb. You might not think it's worth it. You might begin to doubt, but you can't take any shortcuts. You gotta stick it out.
And Words Fail gets you such a good glimpse into Evan's head.
I never meant to make it such a mess. I never thought that it would go this far. Words fail. Words fail. There's nothing I can say.
And the kind of lack of music makes you feel like you're right there with him, as there isn't anything to back him up. It's just him kind of trying to figure out what to say. Good for You feels like you're being attacked.
Does it cross your mind to be slightly sorry? Do you even care that you might be wrong? I'll shut my mouth and I'll let you go. Is that good for you? Would that be good for you? You. I'll just sit back while you run the show. Is that good for you? Would that be good for you? You.
The finale feels so beautiful and like such a fitting conclusion.
Dear Evan Hansen, today is going to be a good day. And here's why, because today at least you're you, and that's enough.
All we see is sky for forever.
All I see is sky for forever.
All of the music of this show is so well written, and it's not big and flashy and look at all the internal rhyming and callbacks, but it does exactly what it needs to in a way that makes you feel the emotions that the characters are feeling, and by kind of creating that feeling in the music and in the book, casting some great actors and giving them the space to really portray that the way they want to, by melding all three of those, you kind of have the trifecta of perfect theater, where the music sounds perfect because the lyrics are so intentional, and the orchestrations help to back that up and elevate it, and the book sounds very similar and helps to carry you from song to song in a way that feels organic and not predetermined, and the actors are so good. It creates a show that is so much more than the sum of its parts. You know, I think Dear Evan Hansen is successful because it tells a story that a lot of people can relate to in some way. It has really well written music, a very well conceived and executed book, and some outstanding performances. It creates a story where the audience feels like they have an active place in the show and ties it to the real world to give it another layer of authenticity, creating an experience that reveals the humanity in us all and manages to bring people together in a way that few things can. Next week's episode is all about a podcast musical called 36 Questions, which is a show that I talked briefly about back in season 1, in case you want something to watch until then, or have any questions, maybe 36 of them. Okay. Anyway, until next week, make sure to eat some pizza because it's good. Farewell.